We used to catch the rail motor from the level crossing.
Caught the rail motor to rural school.
The rail motor?
My first year of high school, I went in the Rattler every day.
On Monday mornings very early, the Rattler would go out.
We used to go to Gympie for sport on the rail motor, yeah.
I've got a long association with the Rattler.
I was the Deputy Chair of the Mary Valley Heritage Rail Committee for 13 years.
I better tell you about the Rattler. As a little boy, I would go down to, with my dad, down to the mill yard because there was timber always going out on the rail motor, or in the H wagons out of Imbil Yard. There were logs, and there are photos in our house of a whole big log yard that grandfather, in part, along with many other teamsters, was responsible for putting timber there. So I knew the railway, and I don't know at what age it was. Probably when I was about 6, I got my first clockwork train set. And I'd spend hours there on that if I wasn't in my red car, pedal car under the house. So the railway grew up, and the station master in the mid-1950s was a guy called Cliff Skillen, and he had 2 sons and 2 daughters, the 4th one born while they were in Imbil. And the older 2, Jim and Rob, and the 2 girls, Kay and Helen, were mates of ours, my younger sisters, and we played together. And I'd often go down to the mill in those periods, and we'd have meals at their place, they'd have meals at our place. So the mill yard was an important place. One day, at the mill, top mill, got a new Heister forklift, and it was down the mill yard now. You didn't have to hand load it onto the timber into the wagons, you just put it in with a forklift. And having driven a forklift when I was 6 and 7 every afternoon for a couple of years, I got on the forklift in the mill yard, turned the key and went to drive it. I got the fright of my life. I think I'm still traumatised for it because when I went to turn left away from the train, it went right because this one had rear axle steering. I'd never had real axle steering before. That gave me a fright. I turned the key off and got off and walked away. I didn't want to be pushing railway wagons out with a forklift. So I've never driven a forklift from that day to this. But so the station became a playground in a way. And Mr. Skillen also wanted to compete with Kuranda Railway Station for the most beautiful railway station in Queensland. So the station was enhanced with all these staghorns and elkhorns and orchids that were, and hanging baskets and a greenhouse built out of Wayne offcuts from the sawmill beside the station. And it was a beautiful place. And they did win prizes for the beauty of the Imbil Railway Station around 1956, 57. And so I loved the trains, and then I got the opportunity to travel on them when I was going to rural school in years 7 and 8 from primary school. I think it might have been once a fortnight we came into Gympie and went up to Gympie High School to do our woodwork, leatherwork, metalwork and trade drawing in 4 sessions during a day, and then home we'd go with our teapot stand that we'd just made out of a piece of pine or something. And that was good. Then came high school, not 8, what do we call it? 4 years, sub-junior, junior, sub-senior and senior, 4 years. And I commuted every day. So I think I worked out 65,000 kilometres I travelled on the Rattler, because the rail motor was the Rattler. It wasn't a steam. Other parts of Australia may have called their steam trains with a red wagon on the back of it a Rattler, but Rattler for us was the rail motor. And illegally, of course, towards the end, when Imbil Primary School had now had a high top and the kids were going to secondary school there, and so by year 11 and 12, there were times when I was the only passenger on the train going back to Imbil in year 12 during the week, and I'd be on the rail motor driving it. That was good fun. the driver would teach you to drive, and that was no problem. First you'd learn to use the air brakes, and then you'd use the throttle, and then you'd sit in his seat. And then occasionally when we had a C-17 or a BB-18 steam train, because the rail motor had broken down and the loco was put on the line, I got to ride the plate with the driver from Kandanga to Imbil. So grew up with that. But there were times when, at the beginning, when the rail motor was a big drop centre engine, a powerful motor, was called RM90, and it'd have the big front engine, then there'd be the middle carriage, then the guards van, the 2/3 of that was passengers, and then a dog box on the back added as well. The dog box was usually for the boys going to rural school, which I'd done for 2 years. Most of the boys were in the guards van section. Most of the girls were in the middle section, and some of the older girls would get up with the passengers up the front, and a few of the boys who didn't like being bullied would be up the front being friends with the driver. I estimate we had as many as 150 kids on that, because we'd be picking up not only all the kids going to high school, but the rural school kids, and then the primary school kids that lived on farms who would get on at Mellawandi or at Grace's farm or at Worth's farm at the tunnel, and they'd travel and get off at Kandanga, or they'd get on at there and come off at Amamore and so on, get on at the Dawn to come into Monkland. And so we were picking them up all the way along, and sometimes the rail motor in a winter's morning would never be able to get up the Kandanga bank. Too many kids, too many carriages, and ice on the line, and the boys who are accompanying the driver up the front made sure that all the way up the tunnel hill out of Imbil, they would be putting the sand on the line. There's a sandbox lever there to drop sand, trickles of sand on the line in front of the wheels of the motor, the drive wheels, and they would make sure they'd use plenty of that. So by the time we got to Kandanga and had to go up the Kandanga back, there'd be no sand left. So we'd get on the rail motor at Kandanga, and she'd charge out of over the bridge and across the level crossing and belting it, trying to get up that hill, because to get up the Kandanga bank to go into Amamore, we got over the divide, and there's a very tight curve, and then another one going up there, and often we couldn't do it. We'd get about part way up to the tight curve, and the motor would be slipping and slipping, and once it starts to slip, there's no way. So some of us would be asked to get out and go and put ballast on the line, put gravel on the line to give him another go to help him get up. But we were never very cooperative. While other boys are down the back, if there's some old sleepers, they'd be trying to put sleepers under the back wheels of the back carriages as chocks. They nearly got a fright one day when the sleeper went under and it started lifting the carriage. They thought they were going to lose it. But no, the sleeper fell out. They were all right. But there was every attempt that boys known to boys was made to try and stop that. There weren't many boys involved, but there were always some characters on the line who would be up to some mischief. And so not often, but from time to time, we'd have to reverse all the way back to Kandanga, drop off a carriage, leave it there for the day, put everybody standing up in the other wagons, and off we'd go, and we'd have a run at the Kandanga bank and we'd get over. The latest we got to school one day was 11:45. Because the fun thing was that by the time you got to Monkland, you then had to wait for the other steam trains that were already operating on the line, or what was happening in Gympie Station, and they couldn't clear us, and so we'd sit out there for 20 minutes. That was an exceptional occasion. But the other parts of sitting on that was you learned to love the landscape and got to know every detail on it. I could still tell you where the pheasant kukul tracks were between Mellawandi and the station. Around this corner there's another track across there, and so on. The wallaby tracks and so on. And got to know everybody that lived around the line.
We used to catch the rail motor from the level crossing that was just down below the house. And we used to go down there and wait for the Rattler to come, and they'd stop there and pick us up and take us to school, down to Dagan School. Coming home in the afternoon, we'd hop on the Rattler again, and they put us off there again. But we weren't the only ones. There was heaps of... They used to stop in a lot of places to pick up the kids and take them to the next school. Yeah, just down below the house. That's Hutchins Road. There wasn't a lot of kids on it, but there was a lot of adults on it. Into town, yes. On a Friday, they used to have a third carriage they used to put on the Rattler because there was too many not enough seats for the ones that used to go on it. I used to go on the Rattler to town when I learned sewing. So I learned dressmaking when I was. Yeah, that's how I used to get in there. And I'd walk from the station then down to the School of Arts and then back again to the station. Oh yes, I learned quite a bit there, yeah. Well, I'd do my knitting as I went into town. I knitted a whole dress that way, a short sleeve. No, I hardly wore it. But anyway, I knitted it.
No, caught the rail motor to rural school one day a week. When I was going to high school, I caught the rail motor on a Monday morning. Then I had my bike up at Frank Saw's, which is along Tozer Street. I used to leave it there every weekend, but I haven't worked out how I used to get home on a Friday afternoon yet. I just can't quite remember how I got there. Maybe someone came and picked me up because there were no buses. And I remember going across the Mary River when she was in a big flood boat, and at domestic science, we'd made this baked custard at school, and it wasn't a very smooth journey across. Things lurched and spilled all down here, and I thought, oh my gosh, looks like I've been sick. I'll never forget that. But I can't remember who came and picked me up that day to take me home. Yeah, catching the Rattler to school and getting into trouble a couple of times. So I was playing up on the Rattler.
What would happen if you got caught?
Oh, nothing much really.
Oh, we used to go to Gympie for sport on the rail motor, yeah. We picked in the rep side, you come to town on the thing, and Burley was the end of the line, and the rail motor driver was, I know his name too, but he'd go to Burley, stay the night, but he had to go down to Coolagibba Creek, and he'd start the motor, and he'd pump all the water up for the trains that go there into the tanks. That was his job when he went there, yeah, every night, and then he'd come back to Gympie the next morning with the rail motor, yeah. Not Frank Mills, Jim Mills, I think it was. Jim Mills, yeah.
Oh yes, when I was at primary school, grade 8, we went one day a week into Gympie High to rural school where we learnt to dressmake and all those sort of things. The boys did manual arts and a bit of cooking. And and in my first year of high school, I went in the Rattler every day. Yeah. And as children, that's our only access to town. Mum used to take us in there, and big effort to get us all ready and hop on the train at 7:30 in the morning. We used to have the girls mostly in the front and the boys in the back. And as you went around the corners, you put your head out the window and you could wave to one another. Oh yeah, there was nobody to watch, yeah. We were pretty well behaved in those days. But you could run from carriage to carriage too, like there'd be a door opening and you'd get to slip across. So yeah, no, it was a lot of fun. A lot better than the buses. Yeah. We used to go and meet the railway workers of an afternoon, and they had the ones that they're singular, and they used to push them along. And we used to go and meet them of an afternoon, and we could hop on the back and they'd give us a ride back to the station.
The house where we lived, the house yard backed onto a paddock which went down to the railway line, which ran parallel to Amamore Creek, and it was on the Kandanga side of Amamore. It was between Amamore and Kandanga, so it was, you can imagine the rail traffic going from it, having stopped at Amamore, gone up to Kandanga, so we were on that side of the line. And when I was a little kid, before I went to school, your day was punctuated by all of the rail traffic. There was a lot of rail traffic, and we had a high-set house at the back, and I used to sit out on the back steps and watch all the rail traffic going. And there were various types of rail transport. There was, on Monday mornings very early, the Rattler would go out to go up to Bruloo to bring the kids into high school. But that was the first one of the week. I think it stayed out there every other night. So it went up really early. That would have been, 5 or 6. And then it would come back through, and, that'd take it was quite a long trip from Bruloo into Gympie with the school kids. And then there'd be the goods trains going up to collect the pineapples and boxes of beans and whatever. And then there'd be the timber trains going through, and then there'd be the fettlers going through. And then there was the odd passenger train. They weren't necessarily daily, with the beautiful carriages they're now using for the Heritage Railway. And I can sort of remember all that because that was a bit of entertainment for me as a little child. And the railway line was above the road at that time, so that when it flooded, which seemed to be all the time, but when I look at the levels of the old Normanby Bridge and the creeks we used to ford, was any wonder it seemed like all the time, but the railway still was able to operate. And as I've been thinking about it, I realised how much the community really depended on the rail and the line. And our address, our residential address, always included Amamore Mary Valley line via Gympie. And I'd never thought about it at the time, and I was thinking about that recently, and I thought, well, that's because the mail was sorted and the mail bags went on to the rail motor for that delivery, for that line, because we depended on it for our mail. And I was a bit miffed probably when the Heritage Railway put their train together, because the Rattler I remember was the old rust red rail motor with all the kids hanging out the windows, waving to everyone on the way through. And it used to screech and scream around the rails. I didn't go on it very much because there were buses by the time I went to high school. But people used to go on that to go to Gympie, to go to the doctor, do their shopping and all that sort of thing. But I realised later on, I had to use the lovely carriages because it was a bit safer than that for a heritage railway. And at the station, someone's probably already told you this, but there was always the goods shed with the fruit and vegetables in it and the pineapples, and they'd collect all of those or drop them off. And that was very busy. There were always people all day coming down, dropping off their boxed up or they were in crates then, produce. And there was a person who worked there sort of permanently, and then they were loaded onto the carriages that were then shunted on, and then they'd be attached, I guess, on the way back. And the mail bag was dropped off every afternoon from the rail motor, and that was as the children came through from high school to come off. And that was a fairly important event, and people the post office would close, it was beside the shop, and then it'd take about half an hour, all the mail was sorted, and then we could go and collect our mail. And the Mrs. Dunn, who was the station mistress, she lived just across the way, and she had the job of opening and closing those gates all day, which was a fairly busy job. That was across Busby Street, and where the railway line still is. And that was her job, I recall. Occasionally some kind person would see her coming and do it for her. At the time, I didn't think anything of that, but it would have been quite a job. So that's my recollection of the rail. I hadn't realised till I went to write that up how much it had imprinted on my memory and how much it meant to me as a little kid, because obviously I entertained myself on the back steps while Mum was working.
I've got a long association with the Rattler. I was a board member when we started the Rattler going. That was Mary Valley Heritage Railway Association, and it was made up of ex-Gympie Apexians primarily, and we kicked off the MVHR, and that ran, I think, for about 14 years or so. Since then, I haven't been involved with the resurrection of the train as the Rattler Rail Company. I am very, very keen to get a rail trail here. We've got our first little section between Imbil and Bruloo, and it's a cracker, given that I've walked a lot of, or cycled a lot of rail trails around the place. This is the best. And I think we can do just as well in a rail trail from Amamore to Imbil. I think it'll be just adding another dimension, another facet of what visitors in the valley can do and what locals can do. More importantly, what locals can do. And of course, the more tourists we get, the better facilities we get, like, dare I say it, coffee shops, but all sorts of things will spring up if we get people coming here. So out of the Rattler has come the potential for a rail trail, and sure, the train for the foreseeable future, I'm sure, and I hope will keep running to Amamore, and then there'll be a rail trail for walkers or cyclists or horse riders from Amamore all the way to Bruloo. It fits in with the future I see for the valley. The valley for a long time has been a well-kept secret. People in southeast Queensland, particularly the Sunshine Coast, are only just discovering that this is a great place to visit. It looks good, it feels good, the people here are good, and it'll prosper well into the future.
I also had part in the train. So the decision to turn the Mary Valley line into a tourist attraction was myself and Adrian McClintock, and because Adrian grew pineapples at Dagan. And Adrian, as you know, was the chairman of Widgie, and he was also on Cooloola Shire. And we both fought to get that. I was the deputy chair of the Mary Valley Heritage Committee, Mary Valley Heritage Rail Committee, for 13 years. And so I had my children come in with me to the train, clean seats, wash walls, scrub floors, out to the stations, weeding gardens, mowing lawns. My children also helped build things. They volunteered in there as well. We had a major part in that. Gary, my husband, he's been out on the line volunteering, putting in sleepers, organising groups of people from the valley to put in sleepers when they fell apart and were washed away in a flood. So he was an integral part of the rail as well. It was very upsetting to me to lose that position of being the vice chair for the rail, but all things have to come to an end. I have done some volunteering for the new look rail. It is very rewarding and I love it. I love to get on the train, tell people my stories about the Mary Valley. It's just wonderful, and yeah, it gives you a great sense of ownership that, you know, this is all part of it.